The Myths of American Slavery. Donald, that's an unusual name. Are you trying to defend slavery in this with this book?
Exactly not. What we're doing, Ron, is defending the truth about the institution of slavery. As you know, there's a lot of mythology surrounding slavery, but there's a different side to the story that's either undertold or not told at all, and that's what I'm trying to do.
When I believe the title says The Myths of American Slavery.
Correct.
Well, I thought slavery was just a Southern thing, or at least that's what the PC historians tell us.
Well, you're right. The neo-Marxists love to try to slander the South as if everybody in the South owned slaves and they beat them regularly and raped the women and lynched them and all that good stuff, all of which, of course, is a mythology. Slavery is not only an American institution, it's a global institution. It's a worldwide institution. It's not peculiar to the South. So, and certainly not to America. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Did you know that slavery lasted longer in Massachusetts than it did in Mississippi by over 70 years?
Massachusetts,
New England. New England had slavery for 75 years longer than the people of Mississippi had it. Also, Alabama. Let's look at Alabama. The history of slavery in Alabama compared to the slavery in New York. Slavery lasted longer in New York than in Alabama. So this points to the fact, and we're not trying to slander anybody here, we're just trying to point out the fact that slavery is not a peculiarly Southern institution. It's an American institution. As long as it was needed in the North, they had it. They got rid of it conveniently by saving money, by selling their slaves down South. As soon as the slaves came down South, the pious Yankees all of a sudden found virtue and decided to start damning the Southerners for owning slaves that they had sold to them. And again, it must be remembered, in the South, just like our great-grandparents, they were not slaveholders. I would say anywhere from 80 to 90% of Southerners were non-slave holders. So the idea that every Southerner owned slave is another one of those myths.
Well, that reminds me that the PC historians and, of course, the journalists all claim that the Confederate flag is the flag of slavery.
Right. And if you'll notice in the book, Myths of American Slavery, I have a whole chapter dedicated to the flag of slavery, pointing out that the Confederate flag never flew over a slave ship bringing slaves to the New World, but the U.S. flag did. The 13 stars in the Confederate flag, yes, it represents 13 slave-holding states, but so does the 13 stripes on the United States flag. So the history of our country is involved in slavery. So we need to know the truth about it and not all the hyper activity that's being promoted by the neo-Marxists.
But what about the abolitionist movement? Wasn't it, if it hadn't been for the New Englanders starting abolition, we would still have slaves. At least that's what we're told.
Well, that's what we're told, but as you know, and I know you know this, the first real abolitionist societies were formed in the South. And at one time, Northerners and Southerners worked hand in hand for the elimination of slavery. Unfortunately, when the radical abolitionists came along, this is a different group, the radical abolitionists, they came along and they wanted to condemn anything associated with slavery as sinful, evil, wicked, and that was peculiarly in the South, and they had ulterior motives for that because by doing so they could keep control of Congress and thereby milking the South of revenue. And the slavery issue was just a red herring that they used to damn the South and control the South.
Well, now, what about reparations for slavery? We hear a lot, even some presidential candidates in the primaries have been talking about reparations for slavery.
Well, when you look at reparations, first of all, let's think about what are we talking about here? We're talking about damage that's being done to people. Well, nobody alive today was ever a slave. Nobody alive today
in the United States.
Now, we're not talking about Africa and Asia, and there's a different story there. But in the United States, nobody's a slave here. None of the taxpayers are responsible for what happened back then. But here's an important thing to remember. in the book Myths of American Slavery, I have a whole chapter dealing with the issue of reparations, and I take a look at Africans, black Americans in Mississippi in the 1950s. And remember, post-war Mississippi was the poorest state in the Union. The African Americans in Mississippi were the poorest of the poor. I compare those people to the people who have never been slaves in Africa today, and guess what? In all your quality of life indication, whether it's longevity of life, infant mortality, education, property ownership, all of these things, the poor black person in Mississippi stands head and shoulders above the African. In other words, slavery has been a great boon and a benefit for the African American, not a curse or a damnation. But the fact is, you and I, our ancestors came from Scotland. Guess what? We're better off in the U.S. than we would have been in Scotland. What we need to look at is that we are Americans and we all have benefited from our ancestors in our past, and we need to praise them, not damn them.